You are listening to the Justin Beahm Radio Hour.
Welcome to the Radio Hour podcast. I'm your host, Justin Beahm. The feedback on the previous episode has just been tremendous. So thank you for everyone who listened and reached out. It just means the world, and the responses online too have been incredible. So thank you so much for listening. That was a tremendous conversation with Jess Gowrie, the drummer for Chelsea Wolfe. And she's currently on tour overseas with Chelsea. I think they added some more shows. If you go to chelseawolfe.com, you can check out their entire itinerary for that run overseas. Definitely worth checking them out. I was messaging with Jess a little bit after the show landed, and she mentioned that they really have things dialed in on this tour. And after the first handful of shows, she says they've never been more in sync. So it sounds like it's one hell of a performance. Encourage everyone to check that out. In Reverend Entertainment news, upcoming releases include Matinee on 4K from Shout Factory and Shout Studios. That lands June 25th, and pre-orders are open now. Links to everything, as well as information on the releases, the lineup of the features and things on all of this stuff, can be found at justinbeahm.com. You can also subscribe to the mailing list on there, though I think there's a pop-up that happens when you first land on the site. And if you enter your email address, you'll get notified every time there's a new post on there. Promise I won't spam you. It's literally just when there's a new post, and all the posts on the site relate to upcoming releases, news, sales on merch, or whatever it might be. So it's worth that if you want to keep up with things. The 25th of June is actually going to be a really big day because there's a project being announced that day that has been several years in the coming. And I cannot wait to talk about that on the program here. It is something that I've been pushing for forever, and that has finally happened. And man, did we put a lot into it. So the 25th is a big day between Matinee hitting 4K, which I love Matinee. I'm a huge fan of that film. I think it's one of the best love letters that have ever been committed to modern celluloid. Like a love letter to film, a love letter to cinema, and one of Joe Dante's absolute master strokes. So on that day, we'll have, of course, a new episode of the Radio Hour too. And so I'll talk about this mystery release that I mentioned on that episode and give you guys some details on it. So excited for that. On July 2nd, the Natural Born Killers 4K Steelbook comes out. That's also from Shout. 1 week later, Death to Smoochie comes out on Blu-ray from Shout Studios and part of their Shout Select series. That film is so fantastic, such a fun movie with Robin Williams, Danny DeVito, just an incredible lineup of people, and are one of the great dark comedies of modern times for sure. Death to Smoochie, that's August 20th. And then a month later, I know we're way out on this, but it's definitely already done, is Spiral on Blu-ray from Ronin Flicks. That is the film from Adam Green and Joel David Moore. That is another one that's kind of a genre bender and definitely worth checking out. The interview today is with an artist friend of mine, Kris Kuksi. You spell his last name Kuksi. I can't encourage you enough to look up his work. Look up the art that he creates. Such fine detail on these things. And as you look around the topography of the art that he creates, you find all these tiny little sub-stories within the overall theme of a piece. And as you'll hear in the interview, he uses a lot of found elements. So he uses really tiny figures. If he hasn't found them somewhere, he creates them. He molds and sculpts and cuts and paints and assembles them into these absolutely amazing, beautiful, three-dimensional sculptures. These things hang in so many places, many of which are very unexpected, like a military base on the East Coast, the CEO of Nike is a huge fan and has pieces in his house and at the headquarters for Nike. So please look up kuksi.com. And there's many art sites out there too that have celebrations of his work, oftentimes from exhibits that they've had. There's also a full color, beautiful art book called Conquest, where you can really get up close with some fine detail images of Kris's work. One thing we don't get into during the discussion, but I'm very proud to announce, is the documentary called Kuksi. It's all about his life and his work, his inspiration, and the wild adventures he's had all over the world, as well as interviews with the people who he's inspired. So it's going to be great. We've already started with interviews, and the breadth of this thing is going to be just amazing. Super excited about this because it's kind of my coming out project as a solo film producer and director. This isn't for any studio. It's not a special feature related thing in any way. It's going to be my first foray into just independent documentary, which I'm super excited about. And I'll have more information on that over the coming months as we get deeper into production on it. But we already have things well underway. So without further ado, here's that conversation with Kris. I certainly hope you enjoy it and get some insight into his process and his world and what shaped him into the amazing artist he is. We'll talk to you on the other side. Well, Kris, thank you again for coming on. I'm really excited to have this conversation, and I'm glad we were able to connect.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. It's an honor. I appreciate it.
What scared you when you were growing up in rural Wichita, Kansas?
The country. We lived out in the country, and I had a really terrifying experience out there. And I was probably 9 or 10 or so, and we lived in this house. It was at the end of this long dirt road, and surrounded by a lot of acreage. So it's just this house surrounded by trees, surrounded by this big field. And I was pretty much kind of an only child. I had two older brothers, much older. They were still living with my mother and I at the time, but my brothers were like late teenage, rebellious time, and so I didn't have anything to do with that. So I would just go outside and play a lot. So I think my imagination really manifested from that whole experience. But there was one occasion where it was about like twilightish time. It was starting to get dark, but not quite. And I was playing along the tree line, and I just got hit with this overwhelming sense of being watched. It's just it's like you kind of experience that in life, but sometimes you're just like, what the hell is that? And I just knew to instinctively look to my right, and just beyond the trees, I could see this very distinct, symmetrical face, not human, and it just felt very soul penetrating. And I didn't know what it was, but it scared the hell out of me. And I wasn't gonna go towards it to investigate, right. So I ran inside and got binoculars and came right back to the exact same spot to look there, and it was gone. And it was just, you just, there's times in your life where you experience something that's just can't be explained, or it's just out of the norm, and then it becomes, what the hell was that? Or what if? And then it just became where I just couldn't be alone. At night I had to like sleep on the floor in my mom's room for years, and it was really so yeah, to this day, being out in a rural place, which I'm fine with during the day, but alone out, just terrifying. Yeah. So I really yearn to be part of a town or a city, like live there where there's other people around. So
yeah. Did you tell anybody about that? Did you tell anyone?
Not for many years, but lately I have. Um, I've told my wife about it. I tell my kids about it. It's just, you just never know. And it's really sparked my whole interest with UFOs and Sasquatch and all
Mm-hmm.
that. Like it kind of had the sensation that it was either of those. It was very gray in appearance, large black eyes, and yeah, it's just people talk about these experiences like they feel like there's some telepathic thing going on, and it just felt like you know there weren't any words, but it was just some kind of tuning connection, something.
Was there mythology locally about something existing in the wilderness there?
Not that I knew of. I mean, I was a pretty sheltered child. I mean, I was envious of all my schoolmates who lived in Wichita. We lived outside of it. So, cable television was, such a something I was just like so ready for. So, I wasn't aware of any kind of cultural thing like that. Like this was kind of before the time of like the gray aliens sort of became sort of saturated into our psyche. People like Whitley Strieber talking about it, and um, yeah. So I will say like a lot of these experiences, people report near a body of water, and we lived right next to the Little Arkansas River, so it was just maybe a quarter of a mile away. So I could only speculate. Maybe that has something to do with it, but it was really odd.
Tell me about your grandmother and your bond with her. And you've mentioned before in some interviews, you've talked a little bit about her storytelling and things like that.
Yeah, so my grandmother was yeah, she was in her 70s, around the time that I could recall, but she pretty much babysat me either during the summer or after school until my mother was done with work. And so she was really very pragmatic, very logical minded. She was educated. She could have taught school. So she got me turned on to history, that sort of thing. Um, she would help me with math. I was just poor at math, still poor at math, but uh, she was just very knowledgeable. It was just, something I could feel grounded with. Unfortunately, she died of a sudden heart attack when I was 10 years old
Mm,
while she was picking mulberries under a tree near her home. So it was kind of a peaceful way for her to go, but it was just, as a child, you never think about that or expect it. And
right.
it's just such a shock when you have somebody close to you just gone. And so there was that in between, my mother having alcoholic husbands. I had stepfathers that were alcoholic and abusive. And so, that just kind of created a mix for someone to just go very insular into their own world, develop their imagination. So, I don't know if I would be the same person if I just grew up in an urban area, assimilated with the rest of pop culture. So it's kind of one of those mysteries.
I was super close with my grandmother as well. And her passing came when I was on a vacation. I was stuck in the Outer Banks at this house with some friends for a weekend. And
And
and I had no way to get back. And my dad calls me and he's like, I mean, my grandma was the only one in the family that ever wanted to read my writing or asked how hockey was going or whatever it was. It's like no one else cared really. And like you talk about that mulberry being a peaceful passing for her. That's so incredible that she had the chance to sort of be in that environment there. Um, I'll never forget
yeah,
the day.
it happened during the day, and I remember waking up that morning and my mother saying that they couldn't find her. I
Mm,
had a cousin who was living with her at a time. Her name was Sandy, and she came home that evening before and couldn't find her. And the next day, somebody got like a couple of high schoolers from the local school and to go look for her, and they found her. So I don't know how that came about, but imagine that was pretty traumatic for
Yeah.
two high schoolers tasked to find some elderly woman.
Yeah. That's
So
wild. I got the call from my dad, and he said that I'm at the care center with grandma, and she's on her way. They say she probably has about an hour left or so. And it was this this dichotomy that I've always been fascinated with in places like amusement parks, that are when something tragic happens there, when there's amusement park accidents, even the beginning of Lost Boys, when they have that overhead shot at night and you see all the lights shutting off on the Ferris wheel and on the roller coaster and everything.
yeah,
Just the sort of shutting down, the darkness that sort of bleeds into places of joy has always been really fascinating for me. And here I was on this vacation at this beach house, and the most impactful moment of this time in my life was happening. And I had the call with my grandmother, and it was like normal. She wanted to hear about what I had been working on and everything. We didn't talk at all about what was happening. And she just stressed how much she loved me and then hung up the phone. And then I just sat there in the driveway and just broke down completely, just absolutely lost it. So I did have the
yeah,
opportunity. I wish you would have had that, like a moment to say goodbye to her. I understand that feels like just a sudden and then gone. But man, it can have such an impact, these
yeah.
losses.
That's very unfortunate. Sorry to hear that. And
Yeah.
I can look at how, being away at some fun place, you have an elevated sense of joy and fun, but then you're hit with this, and that's always something I always think about, in moments of like extreme joy. Like that always seems so fragile. Like bad news could come at any moment. It's
Yeah.
almost like you expect it. And so I've kind of become uh, someone in life who is just sort of always expecting horrible news at any moment. So I mean that's kind of a part of my overthinking as well.
Yeah.
But
A survival tactic. It's like a survival tactic, but at the same time, it if we let it get out of control, it can kind of prevent other things from happening. It can be kind of hard to
right,
manage. And I find myself walking that same line, but I have to put this optimism in front of it, almost like throwing a shroud over the the known reality of the potential for something bad to happen, just so I can continue to be productive and do stuff.
yeah, it's kind of like always expecting unexpected.
Yeah.
And yeah, then some years later, kind of a similar situation where I didn't know my biological father at all. And he, after I was born, he was totally absent. In fact, he didn't uh, want to believe that I was his son.
Hmm.
He just kind of felt like he was having an affair with somebody else and living elsewhere. And so he was never there, no communication until he was on his deathbed. And so my brothers had kind of reconnected contact with him, gone to visit him. But then my sister in law calls me one day and she says, well, he only has about 72 hours left to live. You want to go meet him? I go, yeah,
Wow.
I do. Because that was, a big shadow side in one's life. Because it's kind of odd thinking that, you have this mother, you have these, dysfunctional family life, these alcoholic stepfathers, but knowing that your real father is out there somewhere and not knowing anything or ever spoken to him. So I traveled to Missouri to a small town called Humansville, believe it or not. And there he is, uh, slowly deteriorating on this hospital bed. And the haunting part was that he was beyond the ability to talk cohesively. coherent, so he was just moaning. But that moaning sounded like if I were to moan, it was like the same voice, and that
Mm.
was really disturbing. And so I held his hand, but I couldn't say anything to him, because you're just sort of in shock in that moment. And he was someone who was just very recklessly alcoholic, sold uh, illegal electronics. I don't know how you do that, but he made a living doing that. And he lived out in this rural Missouri area, so it's just a lot of drinking and shooting guns, and just a party animal, pretty much. Complete polar opposite of my mother. But yeah, so here I am meeting this guy, and he passes away the next day. I wasn't there at the time. I was with one of my brothers. We were visiting the little town of Ash Grove where we lived at the time. But the call came in that he had passed away. But I was happy to have finally met him. I hope that he was aware that I was there. It really became one of those kind of life altering moments where uh, it's like at that instant moment, like those instinctual biological urges kick in. And I keep mentioning this sort of teenage rebellion, but that was something that just really hit me at that moment. Like to see this man in such an awful state and to see his life choices, and for him to sort of cast me out or not admit that I was his, it kind of became like, I don't want to end up like this. Like, I'm glad that this chapter is closed, but you know, I can't be lazy in life. I can't, like, I gotta do something. I have to really follow my dreams. I don't want to wind up like this. I don't want this to repeat ever. And so it really became that, I really wanted to full on pursue an art career because I knew from day one that's what I was going to be. And I just delved into the darker realms because that's uncomfortable. And when you're in such threatening, uncomfortable places, it comes out, and you have to embrace it, harness it. You have to confront it. You know, his demons consumed him. And so it was such a great example for for me to calibrate life.
Mm.
And so I did this thing where I changed the spelling of my name, so it's not how it was originally spelled. And so I wanted to kind of rebrand that, sort of divorce my father in that
Hmm.
way. And so I did that. And my older brothers never had children of their own. They married women who had previous children, previous marriages.
Mhm.
And so I eventually got married, had two sons, and I married again, and we just had a daughter.
Mhm.
And so it's like, here I am creating this whole new lineage out of that. So
I was going to ask you about the name spelling change, and I was wondering what had prompted that. And you cited before, you said that that him passing was a real transformative moment for you. So it sounds like that triggered a
yeah,
lot. That kind of triggered everything.
yeah. I remember, after he died, we're sitting in his home, which was just sort of this kind of half dug in earth home next to this big pond, and here are all these local people, very rural Missouri type people. And it just kind of hit me, and I just left the house and I just took off running
Mm.
down the driveway, down the highway for a while. It's just like some kind of switch just clicked. And yeah, like I was saying earlier, like this is one of those life changing moments.
Uh,
And yeah, when it came to just pursuing an art career, it's like I don't like labels or preconceived prejudices on that we have of each other. And so I really experimented with that idea that you weren't able to choose where you came from or the settings you were in, but you do have the power to change that, alter it. You know, like, and that really struggled spiritually because my mother was very Catholic and she wanted me to be a part of that. And so I was a nice little altar boy for some years, but everything about that institution I just completely rebelled against. And I was just so, upset at this, centuries long infection that has over humanity and is continuing into this country, this whole
Yeah.
Christian nationalism. Like, it's just horrible, horrible results. And it just plagues on so much of your own biological desires. Your urges, your deep rooted primal things are just illegal in the eyes of
Right.
religion because it's all about control. And so it's just that sort of feeling that, and with the Catholicism is like, well, once you're Catholic, you can never be un-Catholic, even if you don't go to church. I'm like, fuck that. That's such fucking bullshit.
I grew up in that too. I grew up Catholic, and I always say I ran screaming from it as soon as I could make the choice. As soon as my parents allowed
Yeah,
me the
exactly.
and it took moving away from home for that door to open. But I was getting kicked out of
Yeah,
like religious ed classes and stuff, not because I was being like a problem. I was just asking too many questions. That was always the
yeah.
big issue with
You
me
can't
there.
you can't ask questions.
Yeah.
Getting out of that, I'm very aware of personal freedoms and that sort of thing. You can't control how someone thinks, and I really, respect and appreciate people who whatever they want to believe. That's fine, but don't impose it on anybody else.
Right.
And so, I don't mean to at all bash, the tenets of that religion, but the sense of control and power and abuse, I do not agree with.
Mhm.
And, it's a very disconnected practice. Like, I didn't feel anything, you know, spiritual, soul enriching with it. It's just very verbatim process. Go to church. You have to go to church. You must confess your sins, which I thought was a total cop out because you could commit the most heinous thing. And as long as you go tell this little guy in this little box you can't
Yep.
see, whisper to
Yep.
him, you're fine.
Yeah.
The priest don't have to talk to the police,
Yeah.
And that is not justice.
Yeah, and how many of these serial killers end up finding God at the end because they know that, well, I've confessed. And the
Yeah, Jeffrey Dahmer.
yeah,
Dahmer's like, oh,
he died
I'm
feeling
saved.
fine, well, outside of getting beat to death with a stick or whatever, but yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, it's just so wild, and it was such a confusing thing as a kid to feel that I was so unclean, to feel that I had already somehow soiled myself and was permanently soiled unless I kept returning and hitting the reset button that was confession, that was communion, and that it felt so huge and beyond me when I was little, and it was very uncomfortable from the start. My parents weren't like Carrie's mom or something in the book
yeah,
Carrie. It wasn't like that, but they were definitely like church every week, religious ed, and there were some there was some volunteering stuff that I did because my dad worked for food pantry associated with the church, which was great. That was good for me. But the rest of it, man, was it heavy to hand a kid that level of guilt and shame so early. And when you
yeah.
say once you're Catholic, you can't not be Catholic. Well, there's another element, another layer of that. The second,
There is a psychological psychosis with it,
absolutely,
and
that's what you can't shake. That
yeah,
guilt.
that is very hard to unlearn
Yeah.
because that can become such a deep wounding, and I think I still struggle with that
Mhm.
today. But again, I had art as that salvation, that place to go, and I think one of the greatest injustices in this world is the abuse that the this church has, many of these religious people. It's just fascinating that there's such hysteria over trans people, drag people being labeled as abusers when the facts are nearly every abuser is some white evangelical
Yeah.
or some person in power, politician. They are these people in power. The, not to label it, but the vast majority of that are you know white men.
To bring us up to the point of when you really dove in on art. So you were doing a lot of drawing when you were a kid. You it was a lot of drawing and Legos, I guess, were the
Yeah,
things that were early for you, right?
models, model kits, that sort of thing.
My, yeah, and were you the kind of kid? My son, he will get a kit, even a Lego set, and he never follows the directions. Ever since he was little, he hardly ever follows the directions. He sees everything as he just so reminds me of your art in a lot of ways, in that he's always rearranging his room. He's a noodler with tech stuff, but it's always blown me away how with, like I mentioned, a Lego set, he gets it and then he immediately starts hybrid combining with other things, and he'll make this amazing thing that's nothing that's
Yeah, that's
not even on the
fascinating
box.
because years ago, Lego sets used to be that way, where you could build
Just a
it
box of stuff.
in one
Yeah.
way, but you turn around the other side and you could see two other variations that you can make with the same blocks. And they don't do that anymore, but I could totally relate. That became a big self-identifier for me, in that I could follow instructions to build something, a model kit and such, but there's something about reaching the end of that there isn't quite the dopamine reward that is at the end of that. Somewhere
Mm-hmm.
along the way in the process is that unifying, mental, wonderful rewards place. And so I can relate to where it's much better in the process of it to have fun with it. And it's not about completing something verbatim. And I think I've seen a lot, being an art teacher uh, as well years ago, where I had very creative students that couldn't, sketch something verbatim, but they were very imaginative. But then I had a student who could just like copy something so well, precisely on a sheet of paper,
Mm-hmm.
but couldn't make an interesting arrangement with different objects. Like,
Hmm.
take all these objects and make an interesting composition. Like, they couldn't do that. And it's interesting how, the skills and the perceptions, that artistic spectrum is there, but it's so wide. It's kind of, and I think that plays into, you can never define what art is. Like,
Right.
art is something that's just of itself that you can't put any pin on it. Everyone tries to do that, and our critics will have their viewpoints, and there's so many different genres of art, and those can look at other ones and feel, oh, this is inferior, this is superior, but
Mm-hmm.
in the end, it all doesn't matter, because I think art is just the mental journey in the moment, and it's that experience. You can't define it or put any kind of label on it.
Yeah. And I understand you talk about that lack of dopamine or whatever at the end of finishing a prescribed model kit, because really you're just following steps in someone else's vision. And if you're
Yeah,
driven by a vision, if you're inspired by something, I think that would be hard for me to remain within the sort of guardrails of that, because
yeah,
exploration is a huge part of the joy for me, and I think it is for you too.
yeah. I think with that, a lot of people experience um, something to where they had to make something, had to do something, a deadline, and expecting that reward at the end, but for some reason it wasn't there. Like I could see how, and I've experienced that too, where uh, it's not about that reward system. It's because you might not get it at the end, and I think that in human psychology that can happen with any person's development. If you mess with that in some way or alter it, like it can create a different personality type to where
Yeah.
you can't follow through with something, or you know what I mean. It's like I did a painting for this doctor who wanted to give it to a patient, and there was such a tight deadline with it, and there was such adrenaline going through that and getting it. And it was a painting that I already painted before for him. It was a copy of a 19th century painting.
Hmm.
And here I was doing it again, and much better than the first. And I was just so proud of myself getting to that point and call him up. And then he's like, "Oh, I don't need it anymore right now." And it was such like, and it was
Ugh.
so bizarre how perception of time just slowed down. The rest of that day was the longest day ever,
Hmm.
and how I was so fighting the speed of time to that point at 3 o'clock. And then there's not that dopamine reward system at the end. I don't know if dopamine is a proper term, or serotonin or whatever it
Right.
is.
Well, that's that intersection, though, of art and commerce that I think would be that's uncomfortable for me. That's like when someone asks, "Oh, we would love to have you, whatever, write this or shoot this, whatever. How much would you charge?"
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm always like, "Whoa, how do I quantify this? I mean, what's your budget is how I start. Where are you? And then I'll let you know where I may fit within that." Do you find that intersection of art and commerce to be kind of a weird space for you?
Yeah, that is totally the art world. I have an agent who does that sort of thing, but we always talk about, the approach,
Yeah.
and it doesn't always work that way. We could be in conversation with somebody to do a commission, and then it's like they just kind of fall off, and so it can be hard to where you don't want to undervalue it, but you don't want to scare them off either.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a tricky thing.
And
You know.
especially knowing, like you're talking about the story with the doctor, this may not, I mean, there may not be the finish line that you need to feel like this is okay at the end of all of it. Because I've had the rug pulled out from under projects too.
Yeah, it was something that caused this real struggle that I still have today with deadlines.
Hmm.
There's something about knowing that there's a deadline here, uh, and being very hyper aware of it, but not until like the last final stretch where it's an emergency, and then it's like go time, and then all those chemicals are going off in your mind, but there's still that kind of that blockage where uh it's like it's not expecting the reward at the end, even though it's needed, but it's still this somehow this motivation is hard to get there because
Yeah.
it's it can be painful because the motivation behind it is uh for someone else's usage.
Yeah.
The reward isn't particularly for me
Right.
exclusively. The
Right.
reward comes later when it sells, when a work sells out of a
Mm-hmm.
show. Talking
Mm-hmm.
about getting a show together. And so it's hard. It's still something I've struggled. I've missed deadlines and just, you know, kind of go to those moments where I just give up. Like, it's not going to happen. I can't do it, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And it became, they're tough lessons.
So you traveled the world for for a series of workshops. Can you tell me, like, put me in there? What was this time frame, and what led to all these different adventures that you were on?
Yeah, so in the early 2000s, I kind of branched out from graduate school, in the small western Kansas town of Hayes, where I was getting my art degrees. I stumbled upon these sort of new realist surrealism artists, like people like Alex Gray and Robert Venosa. So I was in Boulder, Colorado, walking past this gallery, and I had recognized Venosa's work, and it's like, holy shit, those are real. And came back the next day and went in the gallery and was asking, and it's like, oh yeah, he has workshops. And so I reached out to the guy, and next thing I know, a few months later, I was in a painting workshop with him in Boulder. Had a lot of fun. Then he's like, hey, we do these workshops in Europe. It'd be great to have you. Or doing our next one in Florence. I'm like, hell yeah. So I left, and this was like 2001. And yeah, I had a wonderful time for a month in Florence. I just always felt like I was at home in Europe with all the art and architecture. So it was really incredible. And, it was like a further exploration in that whole surrealist painting side of me. And so the years following, I went back a few more times with other instructors as well, and just had an amazing experience. But it was a lot of
You and I we're always exchanging pictures of these walkthroughs of these ornate churches and things like that. And I'm just such a junkie. For as much as we talk about the horrors of what Catholicism offered us as kids, the iconography I thought was fascinating. And certainly the architecture was incredible. In the States, we have so little history, right? It's such a young country ultimately.
yeah,
But I can just imagine the joy in you being in these countries where there's legitimate, like real long history and buildings and churches that are so ancient. You must, I mean, how hungry were you to explore these places? Did you get into some churches and wander around?
yeah,
Tell me about
definitely.
what you were diving in on.
Yeah, what's funny about Italy, Florence, well, particularly Rome, is that you could just be walking down the street, where like St. Peter's is, or the Colosseum, all the big tourist
Right.
spots, but you just walk by some random cathedral and like, oh, check out this place. And you go in there and it's just absolutely magnificent. Just some obscure cathedral that's not on anyone's radar, any tourists, but it still blows away anything in detail and grandeur that you find here in the States. And so
Yeah.
it's so abundant there. And yeah, I always felt like there was some kind of old world, past live kind of connection with all of that. It's just sort of that old soul feeling. And yeah, it just felt like there's such a familiar feeling there. And just the environment, sitting in some giant cathedral, just taking it all in. And it's fascinating because they are such a huge, expansive spaces. And it's not too often that we're in like an enormous building. So the sense of space, how far something away is, it's really quite an experience in a huge cathedral, because you see such grandeur, but yeah, you just feel like an ant in it. And
Yeah.
I can understand how that can create that feeling, like when you're in a giant cathedral hearing a choir, like it's a very uplifting, moving. I totally get it. I totally get that spiritual experience from it. So
But that's like your work, where these things, and some of your pieces are massive. They're on various scales, but you create almost from the eye of that ant in the church, where you're examining, then you look up, and then it's different universes and stories being told in every corner of the room. And then the ceilings are painted. Then you head outside and you're finding exterior with the rot and the nature's influence on coloring the cement or whatever might be there, mixed with man-made stained glass and things like that. It's a real hybrid of materials, elements, scale. And it just seems like when I'm looking at your pieces, it's that same kind of, like, I'm at a distance, but then the more I dial in, everywhere you look, there's an infinity. There's like universes within your pieces. Do you think it was that eye of being in those kinds of places that really led to how you create these things?
Yeah, it is, aesthetically, but also in a kind of human psychology sense, and that there's so much societal definitions of things. There's always this concept between small to big. And so you see that in a lot of Renaissance art, this sense of hieratic scaling, they call it. So
Mm-hmm.
the largest figure is the most important. And then it scales down to, the little peasants, off in the field. So there's
Mm-hmm.
something interesting about the scale difference that I really get into, and how when you're creating things in miniature, scaling things down to the tiniest parts, it's like you're opening up a space or dimension just within that piece itself. It's like
Yeah.
that was one of the things I really liked about Doctor Who was the TARDIS, like the fascinating part where you go into this police box and there's just this huge vast ship, and like, how does that work? And so there's a little bit of that where when I make my work, and there is a process to where I don't leave any part of the piece without detail. And so
Mm-hmm.
there's a sense of, there's this little police force in my head that's like, okay, we can't have any boring areas in this place, like I look
Yeah.
along this little area like, this is boring, we need to throw some stuff in there. And it's fascinating. It's like I want to bring the viewer in, when they walk into the gallery, and they're like, wow, what is that? And so you're just sort of pulled into the micro world. So I really like watching people, inspect my pieces. I'd love to someday just put a microphone in the works and just record
Oh
what people
yeah.
want to say.
Yeah. Yeah. People are always spend time at galleries just standing in front of a piece from anyone, and they just stand and they'll be discussing. And sometimes I look at the art and it may not be resonating with me, and however it is with them, and I think, gosh, they've been there for like 10 minutes. What could they possibly, like, what did this lead to? And the discussions on this stuff have to be so personal. They have to be so resonant within them to be mining so much from this. But yours is so easy to do that with, because you talked about prioritizing via scale. You do have central figures in most pieces. You'll have a large central figure, but it doesn't necessarily take priority over anything else that's in there. And that's what I love. There isn't the obvious, all eyes are looking toward the central figure in the pieces. It's like each part of it is its own story, and you see struggle there. It's not passive storytelling. It's storytelling with depth in every inch of these things,
Hmm.
which is really amazing. Have you ever been working on something and you end up in one of these, like, off to the side, and you're really building into a story over there, and then you think this needs to be more, and then you sort of extrapolate these little, for lack of a better term, subplots into larger pieces that are focused on that story? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I have done that. I've done some small pieces. I call them considerably petite wall ornaments. And
Mm-hmm.
so it is that idea, like taking, this and then making it that. But yeah, it is that sense of, everywhere you look is an interesting composition. So that's
Yeah.
why I really get into the detail shots. Like, oh, this is interesting, and that make a great detail shot. And yeah, like I
Yeah.
said, we're talking about the whole hieratic scaling, is that you have the main figure, but you do need everything else to visibly balance it all out. And so it's just
Mm,
like with any societal system, is that you have a an expansive idea of that function or what it's meant to be, but you have to have all these other details and such to make it all work. And so it's kind of something I look at in a lot of aspects of, modern human life.
there is a definite symmetry to everything. They all seem to sort of fit very well into a very comfortable. This may go back to your Lego days and you rearranging and things like that, where there isn't anything that ever feels off center.
Mhm.
And it's amazing that you can find in that symmetry that from a distance just seems simple, and you get in there and you realize the complexity of everything that comprises, but it's still equal. It still
Yeah,
feels, the weight feels fair on both sides.
yeah, and that's something interesting about the human brain. The brain sees symmetry as beautiful or appealing, but too much precision can kind of be boring. And
Yeah.
so it's like I want that symmetry, but there's a little bit of offness, a little bit of chaos to it. And so
Yeah.
it's fascinating how, like, I can look at a blueprint or the instructions to a model kit and, like, just be really into it, just love the schematic of it. But say if it were just sort of faded or erased part of it or just sort of weathered, like, that's even more interesting. And so it's like your brain has a lot of fun filling in the gaps. And so my painting teacher in college is such a amazing simple thing about design. So you could have a dotted line all the way across, just perfect. Like that's neat. But remove one or make one white or red or along the way, and that's even more interesting. And so it's about having an order, but having some, changes, deviations along the way. And so it's
Yeah.
that was something that was really, when you have artistic ability, that's wonderful, that's great, but you do need to know some of those design fundamentals. And so I think that's where I really benefited going to college and, doing that, because I don't know if I would have found that, just left to your left to yourself.
Sure.
So it's there is some important stuff along the way.
In terms of materials, you've mentioned model kits a number of times. I've I, so model kits, found objects, you work with resins, the model railroad world,
Hmm.
like structures and things like that from there, even rocks, sand, and more organic elements. Tell me how, I mean, I would love to know how you're amassing these things. Do you just blind buy model kits? Do you have drawers of male figures, female figures,
Yeah.
animals, weapons? And then how much of that are you making yourself? Are you getting into 3D printing? Are you doing any of this on your own outside of the normal sculpting sort of process? I would love to know about the materials.
Yeah, it's kind of everything. When you get a model kit, it's obviously in pieces. You have to build it. So there is an aspect of building every part along the way. There is a part of this OCD thing that I have where, I have to make each of the parts along the way and then put it into the greater composition. I have done it to where, I just take the raw part and into it and then add it as I go. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not really, I can't really formulate it too much. It's just sometimes I just feel that need for more like pre-assembly versus just directly building onto it. And
Yeah.
so, but yeah, for 3D printing, when there's a certain specific thing I need, I'll do that. Or if I need
Mm-hmm.
multiples or molding and casting, I'll build an original, mold it, and then cast it from there. But it is a lot of organizing, but then disorganization along the way. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
a year ago, I got to the point where there was nothing, absolutely nothing on this floor. Everything was completely organized. And it's just been this long, unwinding process where it's just become complete chaos here. And so I'll be digging around for something and I'll find something I totally forgot about. Like, oh man, I need that. This thing over here. So it's a little bit of being haunted by my own like mental dysfunction with it.
Mm-hmm.
But then again, it's like going back to that art definition is that you can't really formulate the proper conduct of art or an artist and how they behave. And what is interesting about art is that, and I think that the business side of art has a struggle with, because the business side of art just wants to sell the product because the product equals money,
Mm-hmm.
But the collector doesn't particularly want to buy the product. They want to buy the experience. So they know that there was an experience in making this, and that's what they admire. That's what they want.
Yeah.
And so, trying to explain that to a gallery director, it's hard because you can really shock them with some ideas that you have. And they instantly filter as like, well, is that sellable? Like, I don't know about that.
Do you think that having an agent and being sales considerate to a certain extent, has that influenced your process?
Yeah, it has. Sometimes I kind of second guess certain ideas I have, but and I think it just comes down to that you can't really get in the way between you and the collector. It's like I understand the function of that person, that middleman, and all their concerns. Like I get it, I understand, but you can't let it creep in too much. If you get too formulated that way, you can find your collectors are losing interest. It's like they want something that's magic, and you don't want to just copy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have some pretty wild ideas I've been working on that I just know will terrify my agent, but he's been wrong. Like I did this big crazy Medusa piece, big Medusa head. It's like one of my most popular pieces. And he just like, oh, I don't know. And I got to hang in my solo show I had, and some of the other pieces are selling, and it's opening night. In walks this like older gentleman who's a Wall Street banker for Merrill Lynch. Comes walking in, don't know him, and he's just like striking up conversations with all these people. He's blah 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 blah, and he comes over and he's just staring at this. He's got this really nice suit on, like he just looks like he just walked out of the Wall Street building.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just staring at it, and then he's like, "Well, I want to buy it." He goes over and talks to my agent, like, "Hey, I want to buy this," and it's just, that doesn't really ever happen. Like most art collectors will just see a picture of, from an email, like, "Oh, I like that," and it's done that way. It's not so much like in-house, Yeah. And that was the most expensive piece in the show, and he comes in, I was like, I want it. And just again, it's like I proved him wrong that he thought, oh, and there was another piece I did that had a cat on it, and I was trying to get it done for a show before, and it's kind of getting down to the deadline, and he's like, well, I don't know about that cat piece. Why don't you just like leave that one alone for now? Like, and then I finish the other pieces, but then I get back to the cat and I finish it, and it too just blows up. The fans just love it. It's amazing. And he's like, wow, it really looks great. And I'm like, but you didn't like it.
This is so much like film. It's like producers and directors, producers and writers, where they bring someone in as a filmmaker, as a director. We love how you do this. We love how you approach this craft, and your storytelling is so unique. You're a singular artist. We have notes though. And then they come in and they slowly start dismantling the vision of the artist. And I've had so many interviews over the last 10 whatever years where directors are like, man, the movie that ended up is not what we originally envisioned when you get too many cooks in that kitchen. So I'm glad that there's only kind of one bee buzzing around in there for you. But I think to your point, your audience wants you. They want a purity in your vision.
Mhm.
And when I look at like the ornaments that you've done, I think that, and I wonder if the repetition of creating those is monotony for you because it's the same thing over and over, or if how much reward can there be in a strictly commercial endeavor after the first one's done, and then you have to make 15 more or something like that? Is it weird to do the ornaments?
Yeah, it can be. But I do have this interest in mass production. Like, there's something about I love things being made in a huge number, and that kind of
Okay.
is a part of my like whole military vehicle fetish thing that I have. Like,
Yep.
I love fleets of things,
Mm-hmm.
like aircraft carriers. I was just so obsessed with those. There's X number of these on here and X number of those. And there is something about I love the army, making an army of it. And I think the saving grace for me is that each one of them is different. They're not all the
Right.
same. So they're not,
Yeah.
they're not just coughed out without any kind of, human touch from me. And so that's a bit of the saving grace, though. But I mean,
Sure.
there is that desire to like change them more drastically.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know how that fits into the selling part of it. So
Right.
it's really
Let's remove a head here.
yeah.
Let's add a demon attacking whatever here. Yeah. And well, you mentioned the military, and I was going to, earlier we touched on the religion influence in what you're doing and how you've really confronted that head on. Were the church tanks an early real point of visibility for you
Yeah.
in the beginning? Was that one of the first projects that really kind of got you some eyes?
Yeah, that was around 2003 when I came up with that idea. I found out later that I wasn't the only person who had that idea. There's
Mm-hmm.
another painter named Mark Bryant, who's a fantastic painter. He's very like anti the machine control his paintings.
Yeah.
So he had done these sort of church tanky things too, but I found out that we kind of independently came up with that idea. But it was just a eureka moment where I had this model tank and this model cathedral, and I just did this. I'm like, oh, that's great. Like, that says so much. It could be either
Yeah.
very critical looking, or it could be very pro. Depending on
Mm.
how the viewer wants to see it. And so,
And you, and you did something similar with your Star Wars influence too, where you combine politics
mhm.
with. So tell me about the origin of that one. That's probably the most directly commercial referential piece that I've seen
Yeah,
where I recognize the ship, kind of a thing. Tell me about the origin.
yeah, that too is just another whim. I'll look at shapes, and it kind of goes with my sense of humor. I just love combining very abstractly different things together.
Mm-hmm.
And it just seemed like, okay, bad guys, who else is bad? Well, Congress is bad.
Yeah.
Put it together, it's a similar shape, it's a round shape with these wings. Oh, that makes sense. And so, and it's fun coming up with a title. So I call that Imperial Rights Fighter. So just, blatantly true.
Yeah.
Um,
Uh,
and so and I have another one that's it's an oil pump, but it's a guillotine as well.
oh,
So I've I've made a fleshed out piece where these men are being led up to this machine, like they're being disrobed along the way, and they're
mm,
completely naked, and they're getting their heads chopped off, and their bodies are led down, and they're given this like colonial patriot head, with the sort of early colonial patriot hat, and they're given this
Huh.
new uniform, and they march off. And so it's a sort of dehumanization, rebranding to where you're just sort of a soldier, a drone. And of
Yep.
course, the oil having such political power on people that, this thing that we all need to live off is what's controlling us too. And just, it's a dark humor piece, but it makes sense. And it's a lot of fun. And I've got some other ideas that are brewing that
Oh, that's
we'll
brilliant,
see.
man. I love it. You've listed some celebrity fans that you've interacted with over the years. Robin Williams, Guillermo del Toro,
Yeah.
and these guys. How did you, I mean, just to speak to those two, Robin has this dark side to him.
Yeah.
And and there's a real depth that came out in films like 1 Hour Photo and even Death to Smoochie and these other things where you got to see a different side of him. And so it's just a fascinating thing. Again, it's that dichotomy of joy and comedy almost with darkness that you're so expert at blending. You guys must have been kindred spirits. How did you end up connected with him?
Yeah. He saw an ad for one of my shows in an art magazine, and he just out of the blue called the gallery. So imagine picking up the phone and it's Robin Williams, like, "Hey, I want to buy this piece, this Kuksi piece." And so, it's just kind of those one surreal moments. And I had another collector who is a casting director. So she's known Robin for years. She helped him get established. And her
Mm-hmm.
husband is like a music producer. So he's helped like big names get together. And so I never got to actually meet him. I missed meeting Robin and Christoph Waltz by a few hours visiting her. That's one of the
Mm,
big regrets in life, because it wasn't long after that Robin had passed away. And I love
yeah.
Christoph Waltz. He's a fantastic actor.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, she would talk about how, we always saw Robin when he was turned on, and
Yep.
he kind of, but he did have a very different side to him. And I think that's just part that, a lot of us creatives can relate to, is that we have moments of brilliance and shining personality, but yet there's this balanced out darkness part that's, crippling. So it's
Yeah.
I totally I totally could understand that in his mind. And I think my work just, spoke to him in that way.
What about Guillermo del Toro?
Yeah, I got an email from uh somebody, like maybe an assistant or something. Um I didn't know who they were, but they were inquiring about my work, and then it just chimed in like, "Oh, hey, this is Guillermo, and just wanted to say hi and like to get one of your pieces." And he was just really colorful, and he's very blunt. And I'd send him an email, and he'd reply, and as we say in Mexico, "Fuck yeah!" And yeah, so he ended up buying a few pieces. And he really loves the monster horror part, and my work kind of was on that sort of fringe, but not too
Right.
directly. But he liked it enough to include that in his collection. So,
How do you know when you're finished with a piece?
I don't. It either becomes to the point where I cannot work on it anymore because it needs to go to a show. So sometimes I feel left hanging with some pieces, like, oh, there's still like this incomplete feeling to it.
Hmm.
So that's happened a lot. But then there's times where I've looked back on old pieces and I'm like, man, that's great. Like, that was really awesome. Or why was I thinking to do that? Like, it's interesting how your sense of aesthetic changes. I kind of look back like, oh my god, I'd never do that again.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever had one that you couldn't finish?
Yeah, there were some that I didn't finish in time, but finished later. Uh, there was one piece in 2018 that I didn't get in time for something else, but I did finish it the next year, and it was
Hmm.
just amazing. I was having such a horrible time in life because I was separating from my first wife, and 2018 is just like this black hole that I don't remember very much. But towards the end of that,
Yeah.
I really felt great that I got this piece done. Like, I felt like there was some, you know, personal victory out of it.
Mm.
And it was in an art fair in Miami, a lot of response to it. And this big time doctor collector bought it. And it's a very fragile piece. And so I was very particular about, when we send it, we got to be very careful. We got to have extra padding and all that. But that didn't happen. It just got sent out and was destroyed along the way. And it's so
No.
heartbreaking because, I insisted, like, let me personally take it there. They were in Vegas, and
Yeah.
being in Kansas, that's not. I'm used to driving from here to the coast. You know,
Right.
like, I love driving, I love traveling, and they're like, oh no, no, we don't want anything to happen to you. And I'm like, and then sure enough, you know, the precautions that I wanted didn't happen, and
Mm.
it was destroyed. And I was like, well, I can repair it. Like, oh no, no, we got insurance on it. He'll just file a claim. And so, the guy got a discount on the piece, but the insurance claim was for the full retail value. And so he spent this amount of money, but he got more back
Mm.
from the insurance claim. And that's just a part of the ugly part that, just like, it's really furious that, I wish I had that control because it would have been safely delivered. And so that was kind of a, big dopamine drop.
Well, and to feel like that, I mean, it meant so much for that to be completed. That spoke to you in a very special way. And then to just, it's almost like when we were talking about losing, uh, like a family member, all of a sudden out of the blue, you just hear, oh, they're gone.
Yeah.
And here you're hearing it, you're not going to believe this. It's broken. I mean, your heart must have just shattered
Yeah.
in that
Very
moment.
unfortunate. And that's a big mystery. Like, well, what happened to the piece after that? Like,
Yeah, that was my
who has
next
it? What are
question.
they? Is it just thrown away? Like, is it being like auctioned off in some weird sale somewhere? Like, I don't know. It is haunting to see the image of it, just knowing that it's just a ghost now. Like, it
Mm,
doesn't. And it's funny because I called it Ethereal Fortress, and that's what it ended up being, just a completely
yeah,
ethereal thing, and it's not there anymore.
yeah. My relationship with what I do is like I work so intently on a title, and I've been so fortunate to work on so many films that are favorites of mine, and over time. But I know going into it that it's like entering a relationship that you know is not going to go well. You know it's going to end. Sometimes we've been through that, right? Where you
Yeah,
meet someone and you're engaged in a relationship and it's intense and it's amazing and you know this is incredible, but absolutely is not going to be long term because this is insane. And I start working on a title and I'm watching the movie over and over to cut these pieces together and all this exhaustive research. And then I'm out shooting and recording and whatever, all of it. And by the time it's done, I've spent so much time with it and I've created these various documentary pieces and stuff. And when I finally turn it in, it's like breaking up with this film where
yeah,
it's saying goodbye to something. And I'm glad that it's accomplished. I'm glad it happened, but there's also a sadness because I know I'm not going to look at that again for years and years. Do you have any kind of a relationship like that with what you're creating? Because these things do take some time as you're assembling them. You're not always just focused on, you're not on just one piece. You have so many,
yeah.
pots in the flame.
That's a lot like what I was talking about earlier, where you're in the moment of making it, and that is the experience, and that is the reward. And so finishing something means death.
Yep.
Like, it's a dread to finish something because that means it's over. And all that wonderful time, that innovative feeling of coming up with the idea and making it and, just the fun things along the way. And then it's like, I have a piece sitting over here that, I really love and I think people are going to like it. But I just haven't quite finished it because there's a part of me in that I'm going to kill it. It's going to.
You're not ready to say goodbye.
I'm not ready to see it die, even though I am excited to see it done. I'm excited to show it to people, but I don't seem to like, all I need to do is put 4 things together and it's done. But I'll get excited about some new project and start that. So
anything to distract you from finishing this guy over here. Yeah. Oh my God, that's so relatable.
It's a weird kind of brain chemistry where you don't, like you're saying, like you don't want it to end. You don't want a special, joyful moment. You don't want that vacation to end and start heading back. It's that kind of feeling.
Yeah. Man, this has been incredible, Kris. Thank you so much for coming on here and talking shop, welcoming us into your shop. Information on the documentary that I mentioned that Kris and I are doing can be found at justinbeahm.com, along with links to the Redbubble merch shop, which has all kinds of Reverend Entertainment t-shirts. On my site also available is the Steve Reverb and the Soundtones Rockabilly Surf album that I played drums on. I just did a remaster of that album, so you can pick that up. I think it's like $10 on there. And I'll send that along with stickers and magnets and stuff. So some cool Reverend Entertainment swag that'll come along with that. Also, as I mentioned earlier, on the site, you can keep up with the latest news, upcoming releases, and you can dig through the previous releases that I have information on there. Thanks again for listening. We'll talk to you next week.
You have been listening to the Justin Beahm Radio Hour. The Radio Hour is a production of Reverend Entertainment, copyright 2024. All rights reserved.